Welcome to DW's Business Special. I'm Kate Ferguson in Berlin. A friendship without limits. That is how Russia and China described their relationship just 3 weeks before President Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. What Moscow thought would be a swift military operation has instead turned into a prolonged and gruesome conflict. Since then, Russia's economy has been severely hit by Western sanctions, leaving Putin attempting to reaffirm existing alliances. But that is no easy task. While Chinese President Xi Jinping has refused to condemn the invasion, he's also stopped short of helping Russia to circumvent those sanctions. To discuss the nuances of Russian-Chinese economic ties, I'm joined today by Nina Khrushcheva, Professor of International Affairs at the New School in New York City. Nina, good to have you with us. I want to begin by looking at these two leaders, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, two strong men who have been in power for many, many years, neither appearing willing to give it up anytime soon. How would you characterize their relationship?
Well, they've been talking about the kind of new level of Chinese-Russia friendship. There has never been such great understanding between the leaders. We also know their first travels for both after COVID was Putin went to China and Xi Jinping went to see Putin. So these are their first trips, and that signifies the great importance. But of course, I mean, China and Xi Jinping certainly is no fool. He is going to use Russia and use the Russian need for the Chinese support, for the Chinese economic support, but he's not going to give up his own relationship with the rest of the world. He's not going to get sanctioned over Putin. I think, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think they're about 30% up their trade in since January or some such. You probably know these numbers better. But nonetheless, for example, a lot of Chinese firms quietly, without all this brouhaha that the Western firms created when leaving Russia after sanctions were imposed, they're just quietly leaving Russia. So Xi Jinping is not really stepping up. He's stepping up in his own interest, but not in the interests of Russia and not in the way I think Vladimir Putin thought he would before February 24th, the day of the invasion.
Right, and we're going to get into the balance of power a little bit later. But first, let's take a little more closer view of the economic ties between the two countries. As you can see, China has become an increasingly important market for Russia over the past decade, accounting for just under 5% of exports in 2010 and rising to 15% by 2020. And the volume of trade between the two countries has risen especially significantly this year, up more than 30% since January. The increase has been especially steep since the war in Ukraine. When it comes to goods traded, Russia's main exports to China include coal, gas, oil and wheat. Going the other way, China mainly sells Russia electronics, machinery and textiles. So clearly there are trade interests on both sides, but many would argue that this isn't an even relationship. Here's how Jean-Pierre Cabestan, Emeritus Professor at Hong Kong Baptist University, characterises it.
I think one of China's obsessions is to prevent China from evolving like the Soviet Union of the past. I think that's Xi Jinping's obsession. That's why he has strengthened the party leadership at the top of the country. And he has strengthened also ideological work and fighting against any kind of liberal idea within China and outside of China. At the same time, from a strategic point of view, I think China cannot weaken its quasi-alliance with Putin, with Russia. China doesn't have many friends around the world, and Putin is one of those most trustworthy friends and partners.
Nina, what do you make of that? Is that really how China views Russia?
I think so. I think, they really need each other in many ways. And I remember there were particularly vivid footage of Putin visiting China for the Olympics in February, right before the invasion began. It was just, I study body language of autocratic leaders. I find it incredibly interesting. It tells us a lot of things. And it was almost like Putin was standing there basically saying "I love you," and Xi Jinping's like, "I know." So clearly, it was very uneven, and clearly Putin was. Putin in greater need of Xi Jinping, and while Putin is sort of sorting out, it has always been this way. I mean, in 2013, remember when Edward Snowden, the NSA analyst, defected to China, and then sort of they dragged him, basically got all the information that they needed, and they immediately got rid of him, and he went to Russia. So Russia is always willing to pick up these political battles, and so China is quietly supporting this, but at the same time doesn't want to stay ahead of it. I have bad news for Putin generally, I think, because in many times before there was this great relationship between the Soviet leader and now the Russian leader and the Chinese leader, Chinese communist leader, and it always ended up in a great disappointment. And I really don't see how this time it's not going to be the same, because the expectations of either side is much greater than the other side can provide. And ultimately, they will start sniping, they will start biting, and it will collapse as a partnership. That's my view.
Okay, so this is a very uneven bromance, you could say. But China and Russia do have a common interest in challenging US power and hegemony. Both would like to see the dollar's dominance reduced, for example. How important is this common desire for essentially a weaker West?
Well, I think it's a useful thing in a sense, because the West has been quite annoying in lecturing and sort of undermining and undercutting both China and Russia. But I still think that Xi Jinping is always very willing to give Putin a much more of a political role, because that's where the problems fall. I mean, economically, you can figure it out. Now America just, closed the chip production and all these other things. So it's going to be pushed economically. But politically, there is less confrontation. There is less animosity. I mean, of course, there's all this conversation about Taiwan, and there's all this conversation about human rights and so on. But politically, Russia is a much greater irritant for the United States. And I think Xi Jinping would love to have it. But yes, they do want to cut down the West to size and to show that they're not running the world. And that has been, in fact, very prominent in the rhetoric of both countries, and that's why Xi Jinping, with all the talk of sovereignty, still suggests that Putin has perhaps some right to fight with the West, although once this Xi Jinping wants this conflict resolved peacefully. So for now, it is an uneven bromance, but now they do need each other, and they do need each other because separately they have no chance with the West. But together, and if India gets involved, there are other countries gets involved, maybe there's a little bit, I don't think it's a great force, but at least there is some sort of force not to overcome the Western influence, but certainly diminish it somewhat.
Let's look more closely at the war in Ukraine. Things have not gone the way Russia had expected, and we have in fact seen a strengthening in the transatlantic alliance, which had suffered under Donald Trump. Give us a sense of how both possible outcomes, either Russian victory or defeat, would shape China's attitude towards Moscow.
Well, that's a billion, trillion-dollar question. We don't know. What does it mean, Russian victory? Russian victory hasn't happened the way victory is. So this victory is a very questionable proposition. So Russia took some territory is being taken back by Ukraine. It's not clear how much Ukraine can still take back, but clearly Ukraine is not giving up. And clearly Vladimir Putin, in response to that, escalates. So he's not giving up either. For China, this war is useful in a sense that, while all eyes on Russia, China can do all sorts of very convenient businesses here and there. But generally, this war is not good for anybody, including Xi Jinping. So if Putin wins, Xi Jinping says, well, we were the only ones, which I actually don't believe Russia would. But let's say if Putin wins, Xi Jinping would say, well, we were justly supported this cause, and look what had happened. And so now we will have the just, because that's what they both arguing for, is stopping domination of the West and having more just security architecture, not only in Europe, but around the world. If Ukraine wins or the West wins and Russia loses to some degree, although I don't believe that Putin can afford to lose. So he cannot win, but he probably is not going to lose either. But say Russia loses, Xi Jinping would say, well, it was our partner, but look, we didn't break any Western sanctions. So they will adjust to either solution. But generally, of course, the resolution of this conflict, one way or another, would be certainly helpful to China and helpful to the rest.
Nina Khrushcheva, thank you so much for walking us through this very complicated relationship. And thank you all so much for joining us for this DW Business Special. While you're here, do check out some of the other business content on the DW News YouTube channel. And until next time, from me and the team, it's goodbye and take care.